She was 92 years old, living alone in a quiet Vermont farmhouse, carrying the same worn brown purse she'd taken to town for decades. No one thought twice about it, until the day two strangers followed her home. Cornered in her own kitchen, with no one but her watching neighbor miles away, Margaret Ellison reached into that purse and pulled out something that stopped the thieves cold. What was inside wasn't money, and it wasn't a weapon in the way you'd think. It was a piece of history hidden for decades that could change everything. Now the question is, why has she kept it all these years? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sun had barely broken through the thin veil of morning mist when Margaret Ellison stepped out onto her front porch. The boards beneath her feet creaked in the same way they had for decades, the sound as much a part of her routine as the kettle's whistle or the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. She paused for a moment, one gloved hand resting on the porch railing, breathing in the crisp Vermont air. The road ahead was still damp from last night's rain, a winding ribbon of gray that led into the small town where she had done her shopping for as long as she could remember. She carried only one thing with her besides her grocery list, a small, weathered leather purse with a brass clasp dulled by years of handling. It swung lightly from her arm, the kind of accessory people stopped noticing after a while. Neighbors had seen her with it so many times that it was just part of the picture, like the neat bun of silver hairpin at the back of her head or the wool cardigan she wore even in summer. Margaret was not in a hurry. At 92, the pace of her days was deliberate. She made her way down the porch steps, her sturdy shoes finding each one without hesitation, and crossed the gravel path toward the garage. Inside sat the same pale blue sedan she had driven for nearly 20 years. The paint had dulled. The upholstery carried the faint scent of lavender from the sachets she kept under the seats, and the engine had a familiar, steady hum that comforted her. The drive into town was quiet. The radio stayed off, as it always did, allowing the low rumble of the motor and the distant call of morning birds to fill the space. Fields passed by in stretches of frost-tipped grass, with the occasional farmhouse breaking the view. She waved to the postman when their paths crossed, her hand rising only slightly from the steering wheel. The grocery store's parking lot was only half full when she pulled in. Margaret parked in her usual spot, 2 spaces away from the cart return, and reached for her purse before stepping out. Inside the store, she greeted the cashier with polite nod, collected a basket, and moved slowly through the aisles. Her list was short: flour, sugar, tea, a loaf of rye bread. But she stopped to examine the apples, pressing her thumb gently into the skin of each one until she found 2 that met her standards. She paid in cash, counting the bills with precision born from a lifetime of doing so. The cashier, a young woman barely out of high school, thanked her and offered a smile that Margaret returned faintly. She slipped the change back into her purse, the clasp clicking shut with a sound that echoed softly in her mind, though she couldn't have said why. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, the pale blue brightening as the sun climbed higher. Margaret walked to her car, without noticing the dark sedan parked near the lot's edge. She placed a grocery bag on the passenger seat and slid in behind the wheel, adjusting her scarf against the slight draft that crept in through the door. As she drove away, the road seemed as it always had: quiet, familiar, safe. She didn't glance in the mirror long enough to notice the car pulling out from the far end of the lot, falling into step a few lengths behind her. The thought that anyone might be watching her didn't cross her mind. For Margaret Ellison, a Tuesday afternoon in town was as routine as the changing of the seasons. The farmhouse came into view as she rounded the last bend, its white paint peeling at the edges, the porch roof sagging slightly, but standing as it had through storms, winters, and the slow passage of years. She turned into gravel driveway, the tires crunching against the stones, and brought the car to a stop. Her purse sat in her lap for a moment before she reached for the grocery bag. Nothing in the air hinted at what was about to happen. The stillness of the countryside seemed intact, the only sound a faint rustle of leaves stirred by a passing breeze. Margaret stepped out of the car, purse in hand, and started toward her front door. What began as an ordinary errand had already set in motion something that would test every instinct she had learned in her long life. And before the sun went down, the small leather purse would matter more than anyone could have imagined. Margaret Ellison had lived in the same farmhouse for nearly 7 decades, and in that time, the rhythms of the Vermont countryside had become so woven into her being that she could sense the seasons changing before the first leaf fell or the first frost touched the grass. People in town often said she had outlived not just her contemporaries, but the very expectations they'd placed on her life. At 92, she still drove herself into town, tended her own garden, and kept the old wood stove burning in winter. Those who didn't know her well assumed she must have helped, but those who did knew better. Margaret had been taking care of herself for longer than some of them had been alive. She had been widowed at 51 when her husband, Harold, died suddenly of a heart attack in the middle of a snowstorm. In the years that followed, many had expected her to sell the farm, move closer to family, or at least take an aborter to ease the burden. But Margaret refused. She stayed put, managing the land and the house by herself, letting her hair turn silver and her back bend slightly, but never surrendering the independence she valued above all else. People began calling her the stubborn Ellison widow in half-joking tones, though there was always a measure of respect in the way they said it. Her days began early, not because she needed to rise at dawn anymore, but because she always had. The first thing she did each morning was put on the kettle, then open the front door and gauge the day's weather by the air on her face. In summer, the scent of wildflowers drifted across the fields. In winter, the cold bit into her skin with a kind of sharp honesty she found oddly comforting. She would make her tea, sit at the kitchen table, and run her hand over the smooth leather of the purse that rested on the chair beside her. The purse was older than some of the clerks at the grocery store. Harold had given it to her on their 12th anniversary, a small, sturdy thing made from brown leather with a brass clasp. It had survived countless winters, summer rainstorms, and market days. The surface bore scratches and faint stains, but the clasp still closed with a decisive click. Inside, the lining was warm but intact, and beneath the fold in that lining was a hidden compartment that only Margaret knew about. She had never told anyone how to find it. She didn't need to. The purse went everywhere with her, as much a part of her daily life as her shoes or her glasses. In town, people noticed that about her. She might forget her list, she might forget her reading glasses, but never the purse. Over the years, it had become a quiet symbol of her self-reliance. When neighbors stopped by unexpectedly, they could see it hanging from the hook near the door, always within reach. They'd heard stories whispering the way small towns carry tales, that Margaret kept important things inside. Cash, maybe some family jewelry, or papers from the farm's earliest days. She never confirmed or denied any of it. Margaret moved through her life without the rush that consumed younger people. She could spend an afternoon shelling peas on the porch or mending a tear in a quilt. The work slowed but never stopped by age. The phone rang less often than it once had. Friends she'd known since school were gone now, their voices only memories. Relatives called when they could, but their lives were busy elsewhere. She did not resent them for it. Solitude had become her familiar companion, and she wore it comfortably. Still, she was not invisible. The clerk at the post office knew she liked her stamps with historical figures on them. The man who delivered her firewood each fall knew to stack it under the eaves, so she wouldn't have to walk far in the snow. And the sheriff, an old friend of Harold's, still checked on her after the worst storms. But no one ever told her what to do, and no one tried to take away her routines. Every so often, a newcomer to town would express surprise that she still lived alone, still drove, still managed a farm. That surprise often shifted to admiration when they realized she didn't just survive. She carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who had nothing left to prove. Margaret Ellison had outlived more than most people could imagine, and not just in years. She had outlasted doubt, pity, and the small, unspoken judgments that follow a woman who insists on doing things her own way. And though she never said aloud, she knew that her life, as it was now, balanced on a kind of unspoken pact with the world. She would take care of herself, and in return, she would keep what mattered most, her home, her independence, and the contents of that small leather purse, exactly where they belonged. It sat on the kitchen table in the pale morning light, unremarkable at first glance. The brown leather had long since lost its original sheen, softened over the years into something more pliable, more forgiving to the touch. Faint scratches crisscross its surface like a map of small, private histories. Each marked the quiet evidence of a life lived in kitchens, on store counters, in the passenger seats of cars. A stain, faint but stubborn, lingered near the bottom corner, the remnant of some long-forgotten spill. The edges of the strap had darkened where fingers had gripped it for decades, polishing the leather into a smooth curve. The brass clasp at its center was dulled but strong. It had a certain firmness when it closed, the kind of decisive snap that came from craftsmanship, no longer common in the things people carried. Margaret had learned to recognize that sound as reassurance. Once she heard it, she knew whatever was inside would stay inside. The clasp bore a few shallow dents, as if it had once been dropped on a stone floor, but it still aligned perfectly when shut. She never had to force it, never had to coax it into place. It obeyed her hands as if it knew who it belonged to. The purse's shape was modest, neither too small nor too large. It was the kind of bag that could hold just enough to be useful without becoming cumbersome. Yet there was something about its weight that seemed deliberate. Even when she carried only her wallet and keys, it never felt light. There was a gravity to it, a subtle pull on her shoulder when she slung it over one arm. People noticed the person passing, but never gave it thought. In town, it was simply Margaret's bag, a fixed part of her silhouette like the careful knot of her scarf or the straight set of her shoulders. Inside, the lining was faded to a soft beige, worn smooth in some places and frayed in others. A small tear near the seam revealed a darker layer beneath, one that did not quite match the rest of the interior. To anyone else, it would have looked like a repair or a reinforcement in the stitching. But Margaret knew better. Beneath that fold of fabric was a hidden compartment Harold had shown her once, many years ago. He had called a bit of old-fashioned foresight, though he never explained why it should be necessary. She had promised to keep it as it was, and to never let anyone else open it. Over the years, she had placed certain things inside, items that mattered enough to keep close, but not in plain sight. The bag smelled faintly of leather still, though it was now layered with a subtler sense of lavender sachets and the occasional hint of tea leaves. The zipper on the small inner pocket was slightly stiff from disuse. She kept only a few coins and a spare handkerchief there. The rest of the space was unremarkable, scattered with practical things. A pen, a folded shopping list, a small tin of mints, a packet of tissues. To anyone looking in quickly, it was the picture of ordinary. But if you lifted it in your hand, you might pause. The weight was there, consistent, quiet, persistent. Not enough to make you question it openly, but enough to plant a thought you couldn't quite name. Margaret carried it through countless errands and appointments, through storms and hot summers, through years when life seemed too quiet and years when it was too full. The purse had been set down on church pews, grocery counters, doctors' waiting rooms, and the passenger seat of her old sedan. Each time, she kept it within reach, the strap looped over her arm or resting against her hip. No one asked about it anymore. They had stopped wondering after the first few years, assuming it was just a habit or a sentimental attachment. And perhaps that was part of it. But the purse was more than habit. It was more than leather and brass and faded lining. It was a small, constant anchor in a world that had taken so much from her and yet left her with this one thing to guard. The purse, with its quiet weight and unassuming presence, held its secrets as faithfully as she carried them, and no one, no neighbor, no friend, no stranger, had ever thought to look twice. That was precisely how Margaret preferred it. The bell above the door gave its familiar chime as Margaret stepped into the grocery store, the warmth inside wrapping around her after the crisp air of the parking lot. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted from a small bakery counter near the front, mingling with the faint metallic chill of the refrigeration units. The floors gleamed under the overhead lights, their reflections softened by the scuff of years. Margaret adjusted the strap of her purse, holding it close against her side as she reached for a shopping basket. Her movements were steady, unhurried. At her age, there was no reason to rush. She started down the first aisle, pausing in front of the shelf to find the tea she liked. Loose-leaf Earl Grey, the kind that came in tins rather than boxes. She picked one up, turning it in her hands to check the label, then placed it carefully into her basket. Behind her, the automatic doors opened again, letting in a brief draft. Two men stepped inside, Their jackets zipped high against the wind, their eyes scanning the store before they moved past the produce section. They looked like any number of travelers passing through, but there was a certain alertness in the way they moved, as if they were assessing more than just what was on the shelves. Margaret continued down the aisle, adding sugar, flour, and a jar of apricot preserves to her basket. She wasn't aware of the men's presence, nor did she notice the way one of them lingered at the end of the row, his gaze following her. She turned into the bread aisle, inspecting the loaves of the same quiet discernment she applied to everything else in her life. Her fingers pressed gently into the side of a rye loaf, testing for freshness, before she set it in her basket and made her way to the front. The cashier greeted her with a polite smile as she set her items on the conveyor belt. Margaret returned the greeting, her voice low but warm. She reached into her purse, the brass clasp clicking open, and drew out her wallet. Inside, bills were folded neatly in half, secured with a worn leather strap. She pulled out a 20 and then a few smaller bills, counting them in her hand before passing them across the counter. It was in that moment, as the bills touched the cashier's fingers, that the two men took notice. They stood a few feet away near the magazine rack, pretending to browse. One leaned slightly toward the other, murmuring something under his breath, his eyes fixed not on the groceries but on the purse now resting open on the counter. Margaret closed her wallet, slipped it back inside, and shut the clasp with that firm, familiar click. She took the receipt the cashier handed her, tucking it into the side pocket of her purse before collecting her paper bag of groceries. She didn't see the way the men watched her turn toward the door, or how they waited until she was halfway across the parking lot before following at a distance. Outside, the cold air carried a faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. Margaret walked to the steady steps of someone accustomed to icy sidewalks, her grocery bag balanced in one hand, her purse in the other. She unlocked her sedan, placed the bag on the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. The door shut with a solid thud, muffling the world outside. In the side mirror, a dark shape moved briefly, one of the men walking to her car parked 2 rows over. She didn't notice it. She was already focused on starting the engine, adjusting her scarf, and beginning the familiar drive home. The sedan's tires crunched over the thin layer of frost on the asphalt as she pulled out of the lot. The two men waited a moment before starting their own car. Their engine came to life with a low growl, and they eased into the lane behind her, the distance between the vehicles just enough to avoid notice. Margaret drove on, unaware of the watchful eyes that now followed her, thinking only of the bread she would slice for supper and the comfort of her warm kitchen waiting at the end of the road. The sedan eased out of the grocery store parking lot with the same unhurried steadiness that marked all of Margaret Ellison's movements. She had driven this route home more times than she could count, in all kinds of weather, in every season of Vermont countryside had to offer. The narrow 2-lane road curved away from the bustle of town almost immediately, leaving behind a faint hum of traffic for the stillness of open fields and tree-lined stretches that had been her view for most of her life. The sky was a pale winter blue now, the morning's lingering haze burned away by the low sun. Patches of frost clung to the edges of the pavement, where shadows from stone walls and bare-branched maples kept the light from touching the ground. Margaret kept both hands on the steering wheel, her eyes steady on the road ahead. She never hurried the drive. The speed limit signs meant little to her. She preferred the pace she had settled into decades ago, one that allowed her to take in familiar landmarks without thinking too hard about them. The old red barn with its sagging roof, the weathered white church set back from the road, the stretch of split-rail fence where deer sometimes graze at dusk. She did not glance into her rear-view mirror often. When she did, she saw nothing unusual, a ribbon of empty road, flanked by fields gone to winter stubble. The dark sedan that had pulled out of the parking lot after her stayed well back, far enough that it blended into the scenery whenever the road bent or dipped. Margaret's mind drifted to the list of things she wanted to do before the day's light faded. There were potatoes to peel for supper, a loose shutter on the back porch that needed tightening, and the wood stove to tend. She thought briefly of the apples she had seen in the store, but decided she could wait until next week for those. The groceries in the bag beside her were enough, and she preferred to keep her load light when the air had that particular bite that warned of ice. The road narrowed as it curved through a small patch of forest, the branches above arching toward one another like the frame of a tunnel. The shadows here were deep and cold, and the tires hummed differently on the smoother surface where frost had yet to creep in. Margaret adjusted her grip on the wheel, guiding the sedan with the careful precision of someone who knew every rise and slope by memory. Behind her, the dark sedan matched her pace. It slowed when she slowed, took each curve at the same careful angle, its headlights winking briefly through the trees before disappearing again. Margaret remained unaware of its steady presence. She was thinking of Harold, of how they used to drive the same route together, and how he would tap the dashboard twice when they passed the stone bridge that marked the halfway point home. She found herself doing it now, her fingers brushing the worn surface out of habit. The fields opened up again beyond the bridge, and the wind carried a fine dusting of frost from the grass into the air, where it caught the sunlight in a faint shimmer. Margaret glanced toward a stand of pines at the far edge of a pasture, noting how the light shifted through them. She had always liked this stretch most in winter, when the air was clear and still. As she turned onto the final stretch toward her property, the gravel shoulders gave way to ditches lined with dry reeds. The road here was uneven, patched in places where frost heaves had made their mark over the years. She took it slowly, not just for her own comfort but out of habit. The road had taught her long ago that haste invited trouble. In the mirror, the dark sedan was there again, its presence softened by the distance but steady nonetheless. It followed as she signaled and made the final left turn, the tires of her own car crunching over the familiar gravel of her driveway. She didn't notice the way the other vehicle lingered at the far end of the road, its engine idling for a moment before rolling slowly forward. To Margaret, the world still felt exactly as it should. Quiet, predictable, safe. The farmhouse stood ahead, white paint dull by years but still upright and sure against the horizon. She parked by the porch, reached for her purse and the grocery bag, and stepped out into the cold, thinking only of the warmth waiting inside. The crunch of her shoes on the gravel was the only sound she heard. Far down the road, the sedan slowed once more before disappearing around the bend. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as Margaret turned off the main road and into her driveway, the sound loud in the stillness of the countryside. The lane was narrow and uneven, lined with frost-stiffened grass and the faint tracks of deer that had crossed sometime in the night. She eased the car forward, the pale blue had catching the thin winter sunlight, and brought it to a stop in her usual spot near the porch steps. For a moment, she simply sat there, her hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking of the engine as it cooled. The air outside seemed unusually still, the kind of quiet that makes small sounds carry farther than they should. She reached for her purse first, lifting it from the passenger seat with the same care she always did, the familiar weight settling into the crook of her arm. The grocery bag followed, its paper sides crackling softly as she adjusted her grip. It was then, as she closed the driver's side door and turned toward the porch, that something caught her eye. Down at the far end of the road, just beyond the opening where her driveway met the county lane, a dark sedan sat idling. It wasn't a neighbor's car. She knew every vehicle that passed this way, could recognize them by the sound of their engines or the way they moved along the road. This one was different. Sleek, newer, the kind of car she only ever saw in town or passing through. She paused halfway to the porch, her gaze narrowing. The car didn't move. Its windows reflected the pale glare of the sun, making it impossible to see who was inside. A faint plume of exhaust curled upward from the rear, vanishing into the cold air. For a moment, she wondered if they were lost. People occasionally pulled over here to check a map or turn around, though it was rare in the middle of the day. But something about the way the sedan sat there, perfectly still, engine running, did not fit that kind of harmless explanation. Margaret adjusted the grocery bag in her hand and climbed the porch steps, her pace unchanged. If someone was watching, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her rush. Reaching the top, she turned the key in the front door and stepped inside, letting the door close behind her with a muted click. She placed the bag on the kitchen table and set her purse beside it, the brass clasp facing outward as if by instinct. From a window above the sink, she could still see the end of the road. The sedan was there, unmoved. She watched for a moment, her eyes scanning for any sign of a driver's face, but the glare made it impossible. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the curtain. She could pull it closed, block out the sight entirely, but instead she let it fall back into place and stepped away. Whoever they were, they would either leave or they wouldn't, and she wasn't about to stand there waiting for the answer. The kitchen felt warmer than the air outside, the faint hum of the old refrigerator filling the space. She began putting away her groceries, unhurried, pausing once to glance toward the window again. The sedan's outline was still visible through the gap in the curtains. A minute later, it rolled forward slowly, tires crunching over the gravel at the road's edge before it disappeared around the bend. Margaret stood there for a few seconds, listening to the silence return. She had lived alone long enough to know that sometimes things were nothing, and sometimes they were not. She closed the curtains then, not because she was afraid, but because she preferred not to give her attention to anything she couldn't yet name. The purse remained on the table, its weight familiar, steady, and for the moment, untouched. The knock came just as Margaret was setting the kettle on the stove. It was firm, deliberate, the sound of someone certain there was an answer to be had inside. She glanced toward the door, a small crease forming between her brows. Visitors were rare these days, rarer still without a call ahead. For a moment she considered ignoring it altogether. But the knock came again, 3 measured raps that carried through the quiet house. She wiped her hands on the dish towel and walked to the front hall, her shoes making soft sounds on the worn wood floor. The glass in the upper half of the door was mottled and rippled, distorting shapes into vague shadows. She could see 2 figures standing on the porch. They weren't familiar silhouettes. Both wore dark jackets zipped up against the cold, their shoulders slightly hunched, hands tucked out of sight. Margaret opened the door halfway, the old brass chain still fastened. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it a faint scent of exhaust. One of the men stepped forward a fraction, enough of the light to catch the stubble on his jaw and the sharpness of his eyes. He smiled, but it didn't reach those eyes. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice easy, practiced. "Sorry to bother you. My friend and I are a little turned around. We were hoping we could use your phone to get our bearings." Margaret tilted her head slightly, taking them in. The second man stayed a step back, his gaze shifting from her face to the interior of the house, as if weighing the space. His boots were dusty, his jacket unzipped just enough to show a dark shirt beneath. Neither of them had the look of men who were truly lost. Travelers who needed directions usually carried a map or a phone already in hand. "You don't have a phone with you?" she asked, her tone neutral. The first man shook his head lightly. "Battery died on mine. His won't pick up a signal out here." He gestured toward his companion, who only gave a faint shrug, eyes still roaming. Margaret had lived alone long enough to know the difference between need and pretext. The farmhouse stood far off the main road, and strangers rarely wandered this way unless they meant to. She kept her face still, neither welcoming nor unkind. "Self-service is patchy, yes," she agreed, "but the highway is less than 5 minutes back the way you came. You'll find a gas station there." The man's smile thinned. "We've been up and down that road already. Didn't see one." "Then you must have taken a wrong turn," she said simply. A pause settled between them. The first man's gaze flickered past her shoulder again, taking in what little he could see, the corner of the hallway, the edge of the kitchen beyond. Margaret kept her stand square in the doorway, the chain taut, the purse resting against her hip as it so often did. She could feel its weight, steady and familiar, and the thought of it made her posture a little straighter. "I'm sorry, but I don't let people in I don't know," she said at last. "You'll have to head back toward town. Someone there will help you." The second man finally spoke, his voice quieter. "It's freezing out here. Won't take but a minute." Margaret didn't move. Her years alone had sharpened something in her, an ability to hear what wasn't being said, to sense the undercurrent beneath polite words. There was something in the way they lingered, in the way their eyes moved, that told her this was not about finding a phone. "Then I'd suggest you keep moving," she replied, her tone final. The first man's smile vanished altogether. For a moment, she thought he might press the matter, but instead he stepped back, his companion following. Without another word, they turned and descended the porch steps, their boots sounding heavier now against the wood. Margaret closed the door fully, slid the chain back into place, and locked it. She stood there a moment, listening to the faint crunch of their steps on the gravel outside, then the muffled sound of a car door shutting. Through the side window, she caught a glimpse of the dark sedan pulling away slowly, its taillights glowing faintly against the pale winter road. Only when it was gone did she return to the kitchen. The kettle was just beginning to whistle, steam curling into the air. She reached for her purse and set it on the table, the brass clasp catching the light. Some habits, she reminded herself, were worth keeping. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her tea cooling in its cup, the faint sound of the departing car still lingering in her mind. Outside, the pale afternoon light stretched across the yard, catching the frost on the fence rails that bordered the property. Those fences had been there longer than she had, though Harold had rebuilt sections of them over the years when storms or rot took their toll. She found her gaze drifting toward them now, and with it came the steady pull of memory. It had been the winter of 1974 when the trouble started. The first break-in happened at a neighbor's place, an old couple who lived 3 miles up the road. They had gone into town for church and returned to find the back door splintered, drawers dumped, cupboards ransacked. Word of it spread quickly, and within weeks, 2 more homes had been hit. The sheriff at the time, a tall, laconic man named Frank Dorsey, warned everyone to keep their doors locked and their eyes open. It was the kind of warning that settled deep into people's bones, changing the way they moved through their own homes. Harold had taken it seriously. He was not a man given to panic, but he understood preparedness. Bad company will come if they think you're an easy mark, he had told her one night as they sat by the wood stove, the wind rattling the windows. Best not to look like one. He'd walked the property with her, pointing out weak spots in the fences, showing her where an old gate latch could be lifted from the outside if someone knew how. He replaced the flimsy locks on the back and side doors with solid deadbolts, and in the front hall closet, he stored something heavier than the broom and the winter coats. A piece of insurance, he called it, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a box that blended in with the rest. He made sure she knew where it was, and more importantly, how to use it. Margaret had not liked the idea at first. She preferred to think of the farm as a place apart from the world's troubles, a small island of safety. But Harold had grown up during leaner times, and he knew that safety was rarely an accident. He showed her how to keep her voice steady when talking to strangers, how to stand so she couldn't be easily pushed aside, and how to read the look in a man's eyes when his words didn't match his intentions. The break-in stopped after a few months. Whether because the sheriff had caught the culprits or because they had moved on, no one ever knew for sure. But the lesson stayed. Harold never took the locks off, and he never let the fences fall into disrepair. Even after his sudden passing years later, Margaret kept to those same routines. She checked the gates, replaced board when they split, and kept the locks in working order. And she always kept the small leather purse within reach. It was Harold's idea to add the hidden compartment to it. They'd found the purse together in a little shop in Montpelier, and after he gave it to her, he spent an evening at the kitchen table with his tools, carefully sewing in the false lining. Not for show, he had said, slipping something inside before closing it up, for when you need it, and you'll know when you do. Now, decades later, with the image of the dark sedan still sharp in her mind and the 2 men's voices echoing faintly in her memory, she felt the weight of those preparations more keenly than she had in years. The fences still stood, weathered but holding. The locks were strong, and the purse, resting on the table beside her cooling tea, felt heavier than usual. Not in a way she could measure, but in a way she understood. She reached out and ran her fingertips over the worn leather, the surface warm from the sunlight streaming through the window. Harold's voice came back to her as clearly as if he were standing in the doorway, telling her again that bad company only needed one opportunity, and it was her job to make sure they didn't get it. In that moment, she knew she had listened well. The sound came first, a sudden, sharp rattle at the front door that didn't belong to any polite knock. Margaret had just set her teacup in the sink when the noise shifted, the unmistakable metallic protest of a latch being forced. She turned toward the hall, her heart already tightening, and before she could reach the doorway, the chain gave a jolt, a pop, and the door flew inward. The 2 men from earlier filled the frame, no hesitation in their steps now, only a grim purpose that carried them across her threshold. She barely had time to take one step back before the first man shoved forward, his shoulder driving into her arm. The motion sent her stumbling, her heel catching the edge of the rug, and she had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. The second man was already closing the door behind them, shutting out the cold daylight and replacing it with a heavier, stale air of uninvited presence. What do you think you're doing?" Margaret's voice came out steadier than she felt, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. The purse was still in her grip, the strap wound around her wrist without her even realizing it. She backed toward the kitchen, the familiar linoleum floor cool beneath her shoes. The taller man, the one who had done most of the talking before, moved toward her with a slow, deliberate pace. "We told you we needed help," he said, his tone stripped of the feigned politeness he'd used earlier. "You didn't seem to understand." His eyes darted to purse, then back to her face. The shorter one brushed past the kitchen table, his gaze roaming over the counters, the cabinets, the small hallway beyond. His movements were brisk, impatient, like a man on a timer. "Let's just get it and go," he muttered. Margaret kept retreating until the counter pressed against the small of her back. She could feel the cool edge of the porcelain sink against her hip. "You need to leave," she said, each word deliberate, though her breath was coming faster now. The taller man's smile was thin, humorless. "You got something worth keeping in that bag. Saw it at the store. Cash, maybe more." He took another step forward, close enough now that she could see the small scar along his jawline, the way his pupils contracted when his eyes dropped to the brass clasp. Her fingers tightened around the purse, the leather warm from her grip. She didn't think about setting it down or handing it over. Some deeper instinct wouldn't allow it. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, enough to keep him from pinning her against the counter completely. The second man began opening drawers without asking, the metallic clatter of cutlery filling the kitchen. A cupboard door swung wide, then slammed shut again. "She's not going to tell us," he said, his voice clipped. "Then we'll find it ourselves," the first man replied without looking away from her. His hand twitched slightly, as if he might reach for the purse at any moment. Margaret's mind was working quickly now, though her body stayed still. She thought of Harold, of the late evenings when he had spoken about moments just like this. The way he'd told her that bad company often relied on the element of surprise, and that the best thing you could do was hold your ground long enough to think. "You think I'm keeping piles of cash here?" she asked, her voice low. "You've come to the wrong house." The taller man's smile didn't change, but his eyes sharpened, and he moved to close the last few feet between them. Margaret felt the press of the counter behind her, the weight of the purse against her wrist, and something else entirely, an old resolve, one she hadn't needed in years but recognized instantly. The shorter man, still rifling through her drawers, didn't see the way her fingers had already found the clasp. He didn't notice the slight shift in her stance or the way her shoulders squared. But the taller one did, and for the first time since stepping into her home, his movement faltered. The shorter man moved with a kind of frantic efficiency, yanking drawers so hard they clattered against their stops, then shoving them back in when they turned up nothing. The sound of silverware rattling in its tray mingled with the dull thud of cupboard doors banging shut. He swept aside stacks of old mail, thumbed through the neat rolls of wax paper and foil, and even knocked over a ceramic sugar jar, scattering white grains across the counter. His voice cut through the noise, sharp and impatient. "Where is it? You don't get to 92 without knowing where to keep your easy money." Margaret stood anchored near the sink, her purse still looped firmly over her wrist, her gaze steady on the taller one who had taken a position between her and the doorway. He wasn't searching like his partner. He was watching. His eyes scanned every small motion she made, but they kept sliding back to the purse, to the way she kept it close. The leather strap was worn soft from decades of use, the brass clasp catching the dim afternoon light from the kitchen window. "Whatever you think I have, you're wrong," she said evenly, her voice free of the fear that was pounding in her chest. "I buy groceries. I pay my bills at the post office. That's all the money I carry." The taller man's expression didn't change, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "Old folks always say that," he replied, his tone almost conversational. "Then you look under the mattress or in the cookie jar and find more than they ever admitted to." He stepped closer, forcing her to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes. "So, where's yours?" Margaret didn't answer. She had learned a long time ago that silence could be as powerful as words, that letting someone stew in their own impatience often made them reveal more than they intended. The shorter man moved to the pantry, his hands raking over shelves of preserved jars and neatly labeled tins. "Why do you keep so much food?" he asked, almost mocking. "Expecting the war to start up again?" "I keep enough for winter," she said. "That's what you do out here when the snow can cut you off for weeks." Her voice was calm, but her eyes never left the taller man. His gaze flicked briefly to the pantry, then back to her. "You keep enough food for weeks, but not enough cash for a rainy day? Doesn't make sense." He reached out suddenly, and she tensed, but his hand stopped just short of the purse. Instead, he tapped the counter beside her, as though to test her reaction. She didn't flinch. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "We're not leaving without it. You can hand it over, or we'll find it ourselves. Either way, it's happening." The shorter man was now opening the cupboards above the stove, pushing aside old roasting pans and enameled dishes. A glass measuring cup slipped from his grip and shattered on the floor, the sharp crack making the room feel tighter, smaller. He swore under his breath, then turned back toward her. "Just tell us. We don't want to be here all day." Margaret's fingers traced a familiar ridge of the brass clasp, not in nervousness but in readiness. She had spent years moving through this kitchen, years knowing where every drawer, every shelf, every shadow lay. The men might think they were in control, but they didn't know the space the way she did. "Easy money," she said quietly, almost as if testing the words. "It doesn't come easy out here. You work for it. You hold on to it. And you don't give it to strangers who can't even ask for it politely." The taller man's eyes narrowed at the tone in her voice, sensing something he couldn't quite place. He glanced toward his partner, who gave an impatient shake of his head, and moved toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The sound of his footsteps on the old wooden floorboards echoed faintly, growing softer with each step. Margaret shifted her weight slightly, the purse still secure in her grasp, her mind already turning over the next few seconds. What she would do, where she would move, and how quickly she could make it happen. The men thought they were closing in on her easy money. They had no idea what they were actually about to find. The taller man frowned as Margaret eased herself into the chair at the end of the table, moving with the same deliberate pace she used for almost everything in her life. There was no rush in her steps, no trembling in her hands. She slid the chair back just far enough to sit comfortably, the old with legs groaning against the linoleum, and then she placed her purse on the table in front of her, as if she were about to count out change for a neighbor's fundraiser. Her calm unsettled them more than raised voices ever could. The shorter man, still halfway down the hall toward the bedrooms, stopped and looked back. "What's you doing?" he muttered. The taller man didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on her, watching the way she folded her hands neatly over the leather purse, her fingers lacing together without strain. Margaret looked between them, her gaze slow and unblinking. "You've torn apart my kitchen," she said evenly. "If you think there's something here, I'll save you the trouble. Sit down." The taller man scoffed, but there was a faint edge to it, the kind that slips in when someone feels the ground beneath them shift just slightly. "You giving us permission now?" She tilted her head, her voice steady. "I'm giving you a choice. You can keep acting like boys who've lost something they never earned, or you can act like men and look me in the eye while you take what you came for." The shorter man stepped back into the kitchen, his hands empty. "There's nothing in the bedrooms, not even a jewelry box." "Of course not," Margaret said, almost with a shrug. "You think I'd keep anything worth stealing in the obvious places?" They both stared at her then, the room filling with a thick pause. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner, the only sound between them. The taller man shifted his stance, the leather of his jacket creaking. "You're not scared," he said, more to himself than to her. "I've seen worse things than two men in my kitchen," she replied. "Worse things than greed. You learn, when you've been on this earth as long as I have, that fear is a waste of time unless it gets you somewhere." She tapped the brass clasp of the purse with one finger, a slow, deliberate motion that made their eyes follow the movement. "Everything you've been looking for," she said, "is right here." The shorter man laughed under his breath, a short, disbelieving sound. "You're bluffing." Maybe, she said, her mouth barely curving into the shadow of a smile. But maybe not. For a moment, no one moved. The afternoon light had shifted, spilling across the table in a pale stripe that caught on the scuffs in the leather purse. The taller man finally stepped forward, leaning over the table so that his hands rested on either side of it. "All right," he said quietly. "Open it." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing not whether to comply, but when. Then she shook her head slightly. "Not yet. You've been in my home less than 10 minutes, and you've already decided you're entitled to what I have. That tells me you've never earned anything the hard way." The shorter man moved closer now, his impatience obvious. "Lady, just open the bag." She kept her gaze steady on them both, her voice calm enough to feel almost cold. "When you're ready to understand that what's in here isn't just money, I'll show you. Until then, we'll sit." It was such an unexpected answer that for a beat, neither man spoke. The taller one straightened, clearly thrown off balance by her refusal to react the way they anticipated. The quiet in the kitchen deepened, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Margaret's fingers rested lightly on the purse, her thumb brushing the worn edge where the leather had darkened from years of handling. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't pleading. And as the seconds passed, it was the men, restless, uncertain, who began to shift in place, glancing at each other, wondering what exactly they had stepped into. It had been a winter afternoon, the kind where the sky pressed low over the fields and the air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke. Margaret had been standing by the kitchen window, drying the last of the supper dishes, when Harold came in from the barn with that quiet, deliberate look he always wore when something was on his mind. His coat was still dusted with snow at the shoulders, his boots heavy with the mud and ice of the yard, but in his hands he carried the small leather purse she'd owned for years. He set it down on the table, without a word, and pulled out the chair opposite her. She knew better than to rush him. Harold was a man who spoke when he was ready, not before. He reached into his coat pocket, his callous fingers curling around something small and solid, and then placed it gently on the table. Even then, he didn't open his palm right away. "You know how I am about putting faith in people," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "Some folks earn it. Most don't. And when you live as far out as we do, you learn the hard way that help doesn't always come quick." She nodded, unsure where he was headed, but sensing the gravity in his tone. He opened his hand. Resting, there was a small, weighty object wrapped in a square of soft, faded cloth. He pushed it toward her. "This," he said, "is not for everyday use. It's not for bragging about. It's not for showing off. This is for when the world stops being polite." Margaret unfolded the cloth slowly, revealing an item she had never seen before but recognized immediately for what it was. It was compact, solid, and meticulously cared for, the kind of thing you didn't leave lying around. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly. "From my father," Harold said, "and from his before him. Each of us kept it, and each of us made the same promise I'm asking you to make now. You don't sell it. You don't trade it. You keep it close, always in that purse of yours, just in case." She looked down at it again, tracing the worn edges with her fingertip. It wasn't just the object itself. It was a history it carried, the weight of generations trusting it to be there if the worst came. Harold watched her for a long moment, waiting for her answer. "I'm not likely to need it," she said, half trying to ease the tension she felt tightening between them. "That's the point," he replied. "You hope you never will. But if you do, you'll be glad it's there. And if something happens to me, it's yours to keep, yours to use." He took the purse, turned it over, and with a practiced hand slid his fingers into a seam she hadn't realized could open. Inside was a hidden compartment, lined with a fabric just slightly different from the rest. He placed the wrapped object inside, smoothed the flap back into place, and handed the purse back to her. "Now it's part of you," he said simply. "No one needs to know but us." Margaret remembered the feel of the purse when she picked it up that evening. It had always been light, but now it carried a subtle weight, one you wouldn't notice unless you'd held it 100 times before. She carried it every day after that, to the market, to church, on visits in the town. Over the years, she stopped thinking about what was in the hidden compartment, the way you stopped noticing the ring on your finger or the scar on your hand. But she never took it out. She never told a soul. After Harold died, she would sometimes catch herself resting her hand on the purse without realizing it, as if feeling for the reassurance that it was still there. She had been tempted once or twice, when money was tight, to consider what it might bring if she sold it. But Harold's voice was always there in her mind, steady and firm. Asterisk, you don't sell it. You keep it close. Asterisk. Sitting now in her kitchen, the memory was as clear as the day it happened. The purse was still here, still heavy in the same way. The hidden compartment untouched. The men standing across from her had no idea what she was holding on to or the years behind the promise she had kept. And she knew she wasn't about to break it. Not for them, not for anyone. Margaret's fingers moved with the same measured slowness she used when threading a needle, each movement deliberate, each sound of the worn leather shifting filling the tense silence. The taller of the two men leaned slightly toward her, his mouth curving into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He thought he knew exactly what was coming. The brass clasp on the purse clicked open with a sound far too soft for the weight of what it meant. The smaller man, rifling through the drawers at her back, barely glanced up, his attention still on the clatter of spoons and paper bills that might be hidden beneath dish towels. Margaret didn't look away from the taller one. Her gaze was steady, sharp in a way that made him hesitate, just for a breath, before covering it with another laugh. "That's right, Grandma," he said, his voice oily. "Make it easy for us." His words carried that mix of condescension and greed that she'd heard before, decades ago, from men who underestimated her and paid for it later in ways they didn't see coming. The brass clasp yielded fully, and the purse opened in her lap. To anyone else, it looked like nothing more than an old woman preparing to hand over her wallet. That was the beauty of it. No one had ever thought to question the way she carried this purse everywhere, as if it were just part of her arm. She moved her hand inside, not fumbling or searching, but going straight to the seam Harold had shown her. Her thumb brushed over the barely noticeable ridge, and she slipped her fingers inside the hidden compartment. The taller man's eyes followed her movements with lazy arrogance, the way someone watches a cat stretch. He thought he was in control of the moment, that she was yielding without a fight. Behind him, the smaller man muttered something about hurrying up, his tone impatient, almost bored. Margaret felt the cool, familiar shape settle into her palm. All the years between that winter afternoon with Harold and now collapsed into a single heartbeat. The weight in her hand was exactly as she remembered, solid and certain, like the past had reached forward to place itself between her and these strangers. She could feel her pulse slow rather than race, her breathing steady rather than shallow. Her grip tightened around the object, still hidden inside the purse, and she let her other hand rest casually on the bag's opening. She didn't rush. She let the taller man's smirk linger, let him believe the scene belonged to him. It was in that waiting, in that quiet refusal to meet their panic with her own, that the balance began to shift. He didn't notice it yet, but she did. The air in the room seemed to change. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the cold draft seeping in on the back door, all of it pressing on the men, without them realizing why. The smaller one finally turned fully to look at her, perhaps catching the subtle difference in her posture, the way her shoulders were no longer drawn tight. The taller man tilted his head, watching her hand inside the purse. "Come on, lady," he said, his voice just a touch sharper now. "Let's see it." He didn't understand that he already was. She held his gaze, her eyes as fixed and unflinching as the bare branches outside the window in midwinter. She thought of Harold again, of the way he had said, "When the world stops being polite." This was that moment. This was what he had prepared her for, without knowing exactly when or how it would come. The object in her hand felt like an extension of herself now, and in the stillness between their breaths, she realized the room no longer belonged to them. They just didn't know it yet. Margaret's fingers curled around the object the way they had countless times in the quiet of her bedroom, when she'd taken out just to be sure it was still there. The metal was cold even through the warmth of her hand, the kind of chill that didn't fade. She slid it free from the purse's hidden compartment in one smooth motion, her movements unhurried but deliberate. At first, neither man reacted. They were still watching her as though expecting a folded wad of bills or an old coin purse to emerge. But the moment the object caught the dim kitchen light, Everything in their expressions shifted. The taller man's smirk drained away so quickly it was as if someone had pulled it from his face. His eyes fixed on what she held, and his body stiffened just enough for Margaret to notice. The smaller one froze mid-step, one hand still gripping the edge of a drawer he'd been pulling open. Both pairs of eyes locked on her hand, their pupils narrowing, the earlier arrogance replaced by a sharp, assessing caution. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight of the object was language enough. It was small enough to fit neatly in her palm, but its design left no doubt about what it could do. The steel gleamed in the faint afternoon light, seeping through the window, a glint that cut through the air like a blade. She turned it slightly, not for show, but to settle it into her grip the way Harold had taught her so long ago. Her thumb found a familiar ridged edge. The taller man took a slow step back without seeming to realize it, his gaze flicking between her face and the thing in her hand. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, voice lower now, stripped of the casual mockery it carried minutes before. Margaret's eyes didn't leave his. She let the question hang there, unanswered, because the truth wasn't his to know. In her mind, she was back in the barn with Harold, his voice calm but serious as he explained how to hold it, when to use it, and, most importantly, when not to. "If you ever have to take it out, Maggie," he had said, "make sure they understand you won't hesitate." She could still hear his tone, not loud, not threatening, just certain. The kitchen felt smaller now, as though the walls had drawn in closer around them. The taller man's breathing changed, no longer steady but short and uneven. The smaller one tried to mask his unease with a scoff, muttering something about just an old lady with a toy, but his voice cracked in the middle, betraying the unease beneath the words. Margaret kept her grip steady, her arm relaxed but ready. She wasn't bluffing, and something in her stillness made that clear. The taller one's eyes darted toward the door, calculating distance, speed, possibility. Margaret saw the movement and didn't flinch. She knew men like him, the way they thought in quick, jagged lines when they realized control was slipping. The object caught the light again as she shifted in her chair, and this time it wasn't just light. It was a memory of every story these men had ever heard about situations turning in an instant. The smaller one stopped moving entirely, his hand slowly leaving the drawer handle. The sound of the metal drawer sliding shut was loud in the silence. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was level and calm. "You've got 3 seconds to decide," she said, not raising her tone, not looking away. She didn't count. She didn't have to. The words hung in the air heavier than the object itself, pressing down on them with an authority they hadn't expected to meet in a farmhouse kitchen. Neither man spoke again. They didn't need to. The next move was theirs, and Margaret knew it would tell her exactly how this day was going to end. The room seemed to hold its breath along with them. The kitchen clock on the far wall ticked with sharp mechanical precision, each second stretching longer than the one before. Margaret could hear it more clearly than she had in years, as though the sound had pushed all others into the background. Tick, tick, tick. Between each one, the silence thickened, pressing down on every person in the room like an invisible weight. The taller man's chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, his breath catching every few seconds, betraying the conflict behind his eyes. He stood at a slight angle now, his right foot turned toward the door, though he hadn't moved toward it yet. His eyes flicked to the smaller man, searching for something, agreement, courage, maybe even a signal, but the smaller one was frozen in place, jaw tight, pupils fixed on the object in Margaret's hand. Outside, a branch scraped lightly against the side of the house, a sound Margaret knew well from countless autumn afternoons. Today, it felt louder, more deliberate, as if even the trees were aware of what was happening inside. The air smelled faintly of the last coffee she had made that morning, now gone cold on the counter. It mixed with a sharper scent of dust and leather from her purse, a smell she had known since the day she first carried it. The taller man's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. The sound of it was audible in the stillness. Margaret's gaze didn't move from him, her expression unchanged. Her hand remained steady, resting lightly but firmly on the table, the object still in her grasp. She could feel the cool metal warming slowly under her skin, as if responding to her own resolve. Somewhere deep in the house, a pipe creaked with the subtle groan of old plumbing settling. It was a sound that usually faded into background or days, but now it stood out, marking the seconds alongside the relentless clock. Margaret wondered, fleetingly, if they could hear her heart beating. She could feel it, steady and deliberate, matching the rhythm Harold had always told her to keep in moments like this. Never rush. Never let them see panic. The smaller man's shoulders shifted, just slightly, a movement so subtle it might have been a twitch. Margaret noticed. Her eyes moved to him for the briefest moment, and in that tiny glance he froze again, his lips pressing into a thin line. The taller one's breathing hitched once more, a short inhale that didn't seem to find its way back out right away. Tick, tick, tick. The sound of the clock was almost unbearable now, cutting through the air like the beat of a drum in an empty hall. Margaret didn't speak. She knew words could break the spell, could give them something to grab onto, and she wasn't about to hand them that. Instead, she let the silence wrap around all three of them, a slow, tightening coil that forced them to feel every passing second. A bead of sweat traced a path down the taller man's temple, catching in the light from a window. His eyes darted again toward the door, but the movement was sluggish, like he was testing the idea in his mind before committing. The smaller man's breath came in quick, shallow pulls, each one faint but sharp enough to cut into the quiet. Margaret shifted her weight just slightly, the chair legs creaking against the floorboards. It was a small sound, but in the tension of the moment, it felt like a thunderclap. Both men flinched, their eyes flicking back to her hand as though expecting it to move. It didn't. She stayed as she was, the embodiment of stillness, the kind that wasn't passive but deliberate, controlled. The longer they stood there, the more the room seemed to shrink. The doorway behind them felt narrower, the path to the kitchen window impossibly far. The air was dense now, heavy enough that each breath felt like an effort. And still, the only sounds were the clock, the faint catch in the taller man's breathing, and the slow, steady beat of Margaret's own heart. She didn't know how much longer they could stand it, but she knew one thing for certain. The silence was working. Margaret's voice broke the silence like the slow crack of ice on a winter pond. It was calm, level, without even a hint of tremor. "You're looking for something that isn't here," she said, her gaze steady on the taller man. The words weren't loud, but they carried in the small kitchen, every syllable deliberate. The taller man's mouth twitched, as if he wanted to smirk, but couldn't quite summon the courage. The smaller one glanced toward the hallway, his shoulders tightening. She didn't rush. She let the pause linger just long enough to make them feel it. "You think you're going to find easy money in a house like mine," she continued, "but I've been here longer than you've been alive, and I've lived through men far meaner and more desperate than you." Her tone didn't rise, yet there was a weight in it that settled heavily in the space between them. The taller man shifted his stance, his boots scraping softly on the worn floorboards. Margaret could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes now, the way he avoided looking at the object in her hand for too long. She leaned forward just slightly, enough to let the brass clasp of the purse catch the light. "What you came for," she said slowly, "was never lying around in a drawer for you to take. I don't leave anything I care about where someone can find it." Her words hung there, not as a boast but as a statement of fact. She wasn't trying to convince them. She was telling them something they had already started to realize. Outside, a faint gust of wind rattled the loose pane in the window over the sink. The sound seemed to punctuate her sentence, a soft exclamation from the house itself. The smaller man licked his lips, his gaze darting toward the front door again. "Lady, we're not here to," he began, but she cut him off, her voice steady and low. "Don't lie to me. I saw you in the store. You saw the cash in my purse. You followed me here thinking you'd scare an old woman." She let the smallest of smiles curl at the corner of her mouth, one without warmth. "That was your first mistake." The taller man's jaw worked, but no words came. Margaret leaned back slightly, her chair creaking under the movement, and rested her free hand on the table. "You think you're the first ones to try?" she asked. "The first ones who thought I was easy." She shook her head slowly. "When my husband was alive, he told me something. People like you aren't brave, you're hungry. Hunger makes you reckless. Recklessness gets you killed." There was no rise in her tone, no sudden burst of anger. It was the evenness of her delivery that made the words land sharper, as though she were reciting a truth she had known for decades. The smaller man's eyes moved to the floor, and the taller one's grip on his jacket tightened. Margaret's thumb traced the smooth curve of the object in her hand, her eyes never leaving theirs. "You can tear apart every cupboard, every drawer, every floorboard in this house," she said, "and you won't find what you came for, because what you're after doesn't belong to you, and it doesn't sit out in the open for fools to stumble on." The clock ticked again, impossibly loud in the silence that followed. The taller man's gaze wavered, flicking to the doorway and back to her face. Margaret took in sight of them both, uncertain, restless, already calculating their retreat. She let them see that she saw it, that she knew the thoughts moving behind their eyes. "I'm giving you a chance to leave," she said finally, her voice dropping just enough that they had to lean in to hear. "You take it, or you find out why my husband made me promise never to sell what's in this purse." She let the words sink in, the last few dripping into the room like water into still earth. Neither man moved right away. The kitchen felt smaller, closer, the air heavier with the weight of something unspoken. And still, Margaret sat there, calm and unmoving, her warning lingering like the echo of a bell long after the strike. It had been in her family for longer than she could trace with certainty, passed down without much explanation, always with the same unyielding instruction. Keep it close, keep it hidden, and never speak of it to anyone you don't trust with your life. Margaret had first seen it as a girl, standing on tiptoe to peer over the kitchen table, while her father carefully unwrapped a scrap of oilcloth to reveal its smooth, cold surface. She hadn't known what it was then, only that the adults treated it with respect they didn't show to money, jewelry, or anything else of obvious worth. Her father had said it came from a time before the family settled on this farm, before Vermont had even been their home. It had crossed an ocean in a small wooden box, carried by her grandfather when he was barely 20, escaping a place where keeping such a thing could get a man hanged. There were no photographs of that journey, no written account. Only whispered recollections passed in low voices at the kitchen table after the children were supposed to be asleep. Margaret knew it was not made for decoration. It was heavy for its size, a weight that seemed too dense for anything so small. The surface bore markings so fine and precise that they seemed impossible to have been carved by hand. When she was old enough to hold it herself, her father had placed it in her palm and told her to remember the feel of it. "It's not gold," he'd said, "but it's worth more than gold to the wrong kind of man, and worse to the right kind." She had never forgotten the way his voice dropped on that last part. As she grew older, she learned fragments of its history, how it had once belonged to someone whose name still stirred anger in certain corners of Europe, how it had been made for a purpose long since lost to time, and how more than one man had died to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. There were stories of others like it, scattered across the world, but no one in her family had ever seen another. This one had survived wars, betrayals, and more than one attempt to steal it. When she married Harold, she told him about it only once, on the night they signed the papers for the farmhouse. He had listened without interrupting, then taken the object in his large hands and turned it over slowly, as though trying to read something in the way the light caught on its surface. "You don't ever leave it lying out," he'd said finally. "If someone wants it, you make them come for you, not for it." After that, he had built the hidden compartment in her purse, fitting the lining so neatly that even she had trouble finding it without knowing where to press. For decades, it had been nothing more than a quiet weight she carried when she left the house, tucked away beneath grocery lists and loose change. No one had ever asked about it, and she had never volunteered its existence. But there had been moments, small unsettling ones, when she caught a stranger's gaze lingering too long on her bag, or when a question came from someone who had no reason to know her name. Harold had always told her that people who wanted something badly enough would wait years, decades, even generations for their chance. Now, as the thieves stood in her kitchen, she wondered whether they even understood what they were looking for, or they were just pawns for someone else. They might think it was a rare coin, a piece of old silver, something they could sell in the next town. They had no idea it was the kind of thing that had made men cross continents in secrecy, that governments had once quietly killed to keep or to obtain. Margaret's grip on it was steady, her thumb brushing over the same groove her father's thumb had worn smooth half a century ago. She could almost hear Harold's voice in her head, the faint rasp of it when he told her that this, more than anything else they owned, was the one thing worth defending. In that moment, she wasn't just an old woman in a kitchen with two intruders. She was the last link in a chain her family had guarded for generations, the keeper of something whose value went far beyond money, and whose danger was greater than these men could imagine. The object sat cool against her palm, as if waiting, and Margaret knew that whatever happened next, it would not leave this house in their hands. The taller man's weight shifted first, so subtly that someone less watchful than Margaret might have missed it. His left foot slid back a few inches, the boot heel grazing the worn floorboards with a faint scrape. His shoulders angled slightly toward the front door, his gaze never leaving her hand. The smaller man didn't move at first, but Margaret saw his eyes flick, once the side window above the sink, then to the back door in the mudroom, measuring distances, counting seconds. They weren't talking now. Whatever confidence they'd walked in would have been hollowed out and replaced with calculation. Margaret could almost see the math working itself out in their heads. The space between them and the door, the weight of the things she held, the unspoken knowledge that if they guessed wrong about her, it would be the last mistake they ever made. She didn't move, didn't rise from the chair. She let them have their thoughts, let them realize on their own that the advantage they thought they'd had was gone. The taller man's chest rose and fell in quicker bursts, no longer the slow, deliberate breathing of someone in control. The smaller one took a step sideways toward the kitchen window, his boot landing on the edge of the braided rug, shifting it just enough to make a soft rustle in the quiet room. Margaret's eyes tracked every movement. She knew what a cornered animal looked like, how it twitched between fight and flight, caught in the trap of its own indecision. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker. The only sound beyond their breathing was the steady, unbroken ticking of the clock above the doorway, each second marking how long they'd been standing there without making their move. The taller man's lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, his gaze darted to his partner, a quick flash of something unspoken, agreement maybe, or resignation. The smaller man's jaw tightened, his eyes still sweeping the room for an opening. Margaret thought her husband's words again. The longer they stand there, the more they'll see what they're up against. She let her thumb run over the smooth metal in her hand again, the motion deliberate. She didn't need to point it, didn't need to raise her voice or issue another warning. The silence between them was its own kind of pressure, one that pressed harder with every passing second. The taller one's glance flicked toward the door again, and this time, Margaret saw the faintest tremor in his hand as it hovered near his jacket pocket. Whether it was fear or the beginnings of a bad decision, she didn't know, but she was ready for either. She met his eyes and held them, unblinking. It was the kind of stare that told him she'd already decided what she would do if he made the wrong move. The smaller man must have felt it too, because his stance changed, the tension in his legs pulling him back instead of forward. He was no longer searching for something to take. He was searching for a way to leave without losing face. Margaret recognized the shift instantly. She'd seen it before, in the faces of men who walked onto her property thinking they could push her, only to find the ground shifting under their feet. The taller man cleared his throat, the sound abrupt in the stillness. "We should go," he muttered, though his eyes stayed on her hand. The smaller one hesitated, his gaze still cutting toward the window, but the fight had gone out of his shoulders. Neither one had turned their back on her, and so they stood awkwardly, caught between retreat and the fear that retreat would cost them their pride, or something more. Margaret didn't move to help them decide. She stayed in her chair, the object resting loosely in her grip, her presence filling the space in a way that made the room theirs in name only. She knew the truth of it. The fight was over, even if they hadn't quite admitted it to themselves yet. And soon enough, the door they'd come through would be the only thing on their minds. Margaret's gaze, still steady on the men, shifted only enough to catch a flicker of movement beyond the side window. The late afternoon light was softening into that pale, silvery hue it took on before sunset, and in it she saw a familiar figure standing just beyond the old fence line. Frank Patterson. He was leaning on his weathered walking stick, one hand shading his eyes against the glare off the field, his body angled ever so slightly toward her kitchen. Frank had been her neighbor for more than 40 years. The kind of man who noticed if a gate was left unlatched or if the smoke from a chimney had an odd color to it. People in town said he was nosy. Margaret preferred to think of him as vigilant. He didn't miss much, and he never hurried his movements, which made the fact that he was already in position mean only one thing. He'd seen the sedan pull in, and he hadn't liked it. She didn't allow her expression to change, didn't let the thieves see her glance, but she knew from the way Frank's shoulders were squared that he wasn't just passing by. His head tilted slightly, enough for her to catch the glint of the small black radio in his hand. He'd already called someone. Knowing Frank, that meant the sheriff was on his way, and probably a deputy or two as well. In a place like this, where people rarely lock their doors, an unfamiliar car was news in itself. 2 men in dark jackets at the Ellison place? That was a reason to pick up the phone. The taller thief hadn't noticed him yet. His focus was still pinned on her, his weight shifting uneasily from one foot to the other. But the smaller man's eyes flicked toward the window, just enough to catch the shape of someone standing there. He stiffened, his lips parting as though to speak, then thought better of it. Margaret caught that moment in her peripheral vision. The realization that someone outside was paying attention, that their intrusion was no longer hidden. She knew Frank well enough to picture what he was doing now, even without looking. He'd be watching the way a hawk watches the edge of a field, still and alert, letting the world move while he stayed ready. The sight of him, there settled something inside her. She hadn't been afraid before, not in the way the thieves might have expected. But now she had confirmation that this was not going to end the way they thought it might. The taller man finally noticed a shift in his partner's attention and glanced toward the window. His reaction was immediate. Shoulders tensing, jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing to take in the distant figure. He couldn't have recognized Frank from here, but the stance of the man was enough to tell him this wasn't a passerby. Margaret saw the understanding cross his face. They were being observed, and whoever was watching was not going to walk away. She let the silence between them stretch, punctuated only by the faint creak of the old house settling in the soft, steady ticking of the kitchen clock. In her hand, the weight of the object was a constant reminder of the line she would not let them cross. Outside, Frank took a single step closer to the fence, his stick planting firmly in the ground, the other hand still holding the radio close to his mouth. The smaller man glanced toward the door now, his earlier search for valuables abandoned in favor of measuring the quickest way out. The taller one's breathing had changed, faster now but quieter, as though he was trying not to be heard. Margaret didn't speak, didn't move. She simply watched them, letting the knowledge of Frank's presence sink in. In a place like this, a neighbor who saw something unusual didn't just stand by. Word traveled fast, and by now, half the road might already know there was trouble at the Ellison place. That thought, she suspected, was dawning on the men too. The walls around them, which had seemed so easy to breach, were now closing in. Margaret kept her focus on them, but inside, she allowed herself one small breath of relief. She was no longer the only witness to what was happening in her kitchen, and soon enough, the sound of approaching tires on gravel would make that fact undeniable. At first it was barely there, a faint thread of sound carried on the cool edge of the evening air. Margaret heard it before the men did, a far-off wail blending with the rustle of the trees and the low hum of insects outside. She kept her eyes on them, her expression as unshaken as it had been from the start, but inside she was counting the distance. Out here in the Vermont hills, sirens didn't echo the way they did in town. Their cry rolled over the field slowly, drawing closer in measured waves. The taller man's head jerked slightly as he caught it, his eyes narrowing as though listening harder might prove him wrong. The smaller one froze in place, his hand lingering on the edge of the kitchen counter, fingers tapping once, twice, before curling into a fist. They didn't look at each other right away. The sound didn't leave much room for interpretation. Someone had called it in, and in a place this quiet, there would be no mistaking whose driveway the patrol car was about to roll up. Margaret let the moment hang. She shifted the object in her hand, just enough of the metal to catch a sliver of the fading light. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder that she was still in control. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the siren's call more clearly now. The pitch rose and fell, each pass louder than the last, the vehicle drawing closer with every bend in the road. She pictured the route in her mind, the old county highway, the turn at the Patterson place, the narrow stretch past the mill pond, until it crested the final hill and the Ellison farmhouse would come into view. Frank hadn't moved from his post near the fence. She could just make out his figure still standing there, and she knew that if she stepped to the window right now, she'd see the same squared shoulders and watchful stillness. Frank had always been the type to stay put until the job was done, and he wasn't about to wander off before the sheriff arrived. The taller thief finally turned toward the door, his voice low and sharp. "We need to go." The smaller one hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window again, then toward her, as though still deciding if he could salvage something from this disaster. The siren's wail cut through the space between them. Closer now, the sound weaving with the steady tick of the clock in a way that made every second feel heavier. Margaret didn't move from her chair. She'd seen animals caught in traps before. How the realization of being cornered could make them unpredictable. Her stillness was intentional, a way of reminding them that the next move was theirs. But it would not be an easy one. The taller man stepped back, his boots scuffing against the worn rug, his posture no longer aggressive but taut with urgency. The smaller one finally straightened, his face shifting from calculation to resignation. That was the moment they both seemed to understand. They had no more time. The siren was too close now, and the sheriff's cruiser would be pulling into the driveway within moments. Margaret watched them retreat toward the door, each step cautious, as if turning their backs might provoke her into action. The object stayed in her hand, resting easily in her palm, its cold weight a steady anchor. The smaller man reached the doorway first, glancing over his shoulder one last time before disappearing onto the porch. The taller one followed, his gaze flicking toward the road where the wail had turned into a rising, urgent pitch that filled the evening air. From her seat at the table, Margaret heard the crunch of their boots on the gravel path, followed by the dull thud of car doors opening. An engine turned over with a rough growl, and the sedan rolled backward down the drive just as the siren's cry broke into sight. A streak of white and blue lights cresting the final hill. The wind carried the smell of dust and the faint tang of exhaust through the open window. Margaret stayed where she was, the cool metal still in her grip, her breathing slow and steady. The cruiser's tires bit into gravel a heartbeat later, the siren cutting off abruptly as the engine idled. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the noise had, as though the land itself was holding still to see what would happen next. Margaret didn't need to look to know that Frank was already making his way toward the porch, his long stride purposeful now. She sat there a moment longer, listening to the soft click of the cooling engine outside and the faint hum of the evening settling back into place. The worst of it was over, but she knew the rest of this night would be far from ordinary. The cruiser had not yet reached the porch when Margaret decided to speak. The thieves were still lingering at the edge of the kitchen, their retreat slowed by an unwillingness to admit they'd been beaten. She could see it in their posture, shoulders tight, chin slightly raised, as though clinging to the last shreds of control. The taller one's hand hovered near the doorframe, ready to bolt if necessary, while the smaller man's eyes kept flicking toward her purse on the table. She let the silence stretch a little longer, the distant hum of the idling sedan outside mixing with the soft creak of the old house settling. Then she leaned back in her chair just enough to suggest comfort, the weight of the cold metal still resting in her hand. Her voice, when it came, was even and unhurried. "You boys think you found something worth the trouble, but you're wrong about what I have, and you're wrong about how long you got to take it." The smaller man froze mid-step, his brow furrowing. The taller one's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if regarding a pair of school children who had stumbled into the wrong classroom. "That thing you're looking at," she continued, giving the object in her palm the smallest tilt so it caught the fading light, "isn't the only thing in this house that people would pay good money to get their hands on. And the ones who want it the most, they don't knock before they come in." The implication hung in the air, subtle but sharp. The taller thief's gaze darted toward the hallway, perhaps imagining what else might be hidden behind the closed doors. The smaller one shifted his weight, his hand unconsciously brushing the side of his jacket, as if reassuring himself that he was still armed. Margaret saw it and let her expression remain unchanged. "I may have promised my husband," she said slowly, "that if anyone came for it, I'd make sure they never left with it. And I don't intend to break that promise now." The taller man's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. She could see the wheels turning in his head, weighing whether she was bluffing or telling the truth. That was when she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough to make them both lean in, without realizing it. "And if you're thinking help isn't on its way," she let her gaze drift toward the window, where Frank's figure had now been joined by the unmistakable outline of a uniformed deputy stepping through the fence gate. "You might want to think again." It was a careful dance, giving them just enough truth to make the lie plausible. Yes, help was coming, but she spoke as though a half-dozen men were already in the yard, ready to walk through the door. Her tone carried the certainty of someone who had outlived worse situations than this, and it pressed against whatever confidence they'd walked in with. The smaller man's breathing had changed, shallow now, quick. His eyes flicked from her hand to the hallway, then to the window. The taller one finally broke the silence with a muttered curse, glancing again toward the door. Margaret didn't move, didn't raise her voice. She simply added, "You can walk out now and take your chances on the road. Or you can stay here and find out why people have been trying to get inside this house for 50 years. That did it. The taller thief's hand tightened on the doorframe before he turned sharply toward his partner. The smaller one hesitated for only a moment before following him, both of them moving with the jerky, deliberate steps of men who wanted to appear in control while retreating as fast as possible. Margaret watched them go, the faintest trace of steel in her gaze, and kept the object in her hand until the door closed behind them. She didn't rise to follow, didn't rush to the window. The bluff had been enough. Now, the sound of approaching footsteps on the porch told her the truth she'd hinted at was about to become reality. The door was only half open when the smaller thief's eyes darted back toward the table. The purse sat there, the worn brown leather catching a thin strip of light from the kitchen window. His hesitation turned into a flicker of calculation, and in an instant he spun back toward Margaret with a sudden burst of movement. His hand shot out, fingers splayed wide, reaching for the purse as if snatching it now might turn the whole night in his favor. Margaret didn't flinch. Her hand stayed on the object inside the purse, her grip firm, the smooth, cold surface anchored against her palm. The man's shadow loomed across the table as his fingers brushed the leather, his breath quick and uneven. It was then, in that heartbeat between motion and contact, that the sound came, a sharp, metallic click cut through the kitchen air, loud enough to strip away every other sound in the room. It was deliberate, unmistakable, and it came from her hand. The taller thief, still at the door, froze mid-step, his body snapping toward her like a pulled string. The smaller man's hand stopped short, hovering above the purse, but not daring to touch it now. Margaret didn't look at either of them immediately. She kept her eyes lowered for a moment, her fingers still resting in the precise position that had produced the sound. When she finally raised her gaze, it was slow, deliberate, and without a hint of fear. The object in her hand remained partially hidden, but not enough to disguise its shape or the suggestion of what it could do. The taller man's throat worked as he swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. The smaller one stayed frozen in that awkward half-crouch, his fingertips now an inch from the purse, as though the air itself had solidified between them. Neither spoke. The click still echoed in their ears, a sound that had a history all its own, the kind that needed no explanation to men who had made their living on the edge of danger. Outside, the siren's wail had given way to the low growl of a vehicle pulling up the drive. Tires bit into gravel, each crunch distinct in the quiet. The timing was perfect, the click still fresh in the air, the arrival of law enforcement, sealing the weight of the moment. Margaret didn't have to say a word to make the connection for them. The smaller thief finally straightened, his hand dropping back to his side with slow, reluctant motion. His eyes stayed locked on the purse, but the desperation had shifted into something else, a sharp awareness that whatever prize he thought he grabbed was now beyond his reach. The taller man stepped closer to the door again, his movements cautious, as though any sudden gesture might bring that sound back into play. Margaret lifted the purse slightly, just enough to rest it against her lap, her fingers still curled protectively around the object. The leather creaked faintly under the shift, and for a brief moment, the only other sound was a steady tick of the clock above the stove. Boots hit the porch outside. Not hurried, but steady, the rhythm of someone who knew they didn't need to rush. The taller thief shot a quick glance toward the sound, his posture tightening. The smaller one shifted his weight from foot to foot, the restless energy of a man who wanted to run, but knew it might be too late. Margaret let the silence hold until the steps reached the front door. Then she set the purse back on the table with care, her hand never leaving its side. The click might have been a single moment, but the memory of it clung to the air, keeping both men exactly where they were until they decided, finally, that leaving was the better option. They backed toward the door, without another word. Margaret didn't rise. She didn't need to. The purse stayed on the table, the object still hidden, the echo of that metallic warning lingering like a line neither of them dared to cross again. Outside, the sound of the door opening and a firm voice greeting the intruders was enough to tell her they were finished here, whether they realized it or not. The first sign that the situation had shifted for good was the wash of red and blue spilling across the worn linoleum. It slid over the kitchen walls, flickered across the wood cabinets, and caught in the glass of the framed photographs that lined the counter. The crunch of gravel under heavy tires followed, deliberate and unhurried, the sound of vehicles that knew they were arriving to end something, not to join it. Margaret sat still at the table, her purse resting in her lap now, one hand curled naturally over it as if it had always been there. Through the thin glass of the front windows, she could see the muted shapes of the patrol cars settling into the driveway, the pulsing lights washing over the weathered siding of her home. The thieves froze where they stood. The taller one shifted half a step toward the back door, only to stop when the unmistakable thump of another car door shutting echoed from that direction too. They were boxed in and they knew it. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the clock. The second hand moved with a calm precision that seemed almost at odds with the scene unfolding around her. She could hear the creak of the porch boards now, slow, measured, the weight of more than one set of boots pressing forward. The taller thief's eyes darted toward the hallway as if considering a mad dash to the bedrooms, but the smaller one's shoulders slumped ever so slightly, a sign that the fight was already draining out of him. A firm knock came to the front door, not tentative but not aggressive either. It was the kind of knock meant to be answered, not ignored. Margaret didn't move to get up. She called out instead, her voice steady, "Come in." The door opened with a familiar squeal of hinges, and the first uniformed figure stepped into the room. Sheriff Daniels, broad-shouldered and built like the oak trees lining the property, entered with his hat in one hand and his other resting casually near his belt. Two deputies followed close behind, their eyes scanning the kitchen in an instant, taking the thieves, the table, and Margaret seated there with her purse. No one moved for a moment. The only sound was a faint hum of the patrol car engines still idling outside. Daniels let his gaze rest on the two intruders for a long beat before he spoke, his voice calm, but leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Afternoon, gentlemen. I think we should have a word outside." The smaller thief swallowed hard and gave a half-step toward the sheriff, his hands twitching at his sides. The taller one stayed rooted for a second longer, as though trying to decide whether he could bluff his way through the next 30 seconds. Daniels didn't give him the chance. "Now," he said, the single word carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Margaret's eyes never left them as they moved. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply kept her hand on the purse, her posture unchanged. The taller man finally turned, stepping past the sheriff with a tight jaw, while the smaller one trailed behind, his eyes lowering when they passed her. One of the deputies gestured toward the porch, his tone polite but firm as he guided them out. The kitchen felt larger once they were gone, the air no longer crowded with their restless movements. The flashing lights still played across the walls, the rhythm of the sirens now quieted to a background hum. Sheriff Daniels glanced at Margaret and gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that no words could quite cover. She returned the nod, just as understated. From outside came the muted exchange of voices, the scrape of shoes on gravel, the metallic click of handcuffs closing. Margaret could see the shadows of the two men being led toward separate patrol cars, their figures distorted by the sweep of the rotating lights. Daniels lingered in the doorway a moment longer, scanning the room before stepping fully inside. "You all right?" he asked, his tone more formality than a question. Margaret adjusted the purse slightly in her lap, and let out a slow breath. "They won't be back," she said simply. Daniel studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing the truth of her words, then gave another nod and stepped back toward the porch. The deputies followed, their boots thudding lightly against the old boards as the door eased shut behind them. The sound of the engines shifted as the patrol cars prepared to leave, their tires crunching over the gravel once more. The red and blue glow faded from the kitchen walls, leaving only the warm, dim light of the overhead fixture. Margaret remained seated, the purse still in her lap, listening as the cars rolled down the long drive, taking with them the last traces of danger that had come uninvited to her home. The house had gone still again, the only lingering sign of the confrontation outside being the distant hum of the patrol cars idling in the drive. Margaret sat at the table, her purse resting squarely in front of her, the brass clasp still open from when she had reached inside. The object lay in her palm, its cold weight pressing lightly against her skin, the way it had so many times before when she checked that it was still there. She let her gaze travel from it to the doorway, where Sheriff Daniels lingered, watching her with a look that was neither curious nor surprised, more the quiet acknowledgement of a man who already knew enough not to ask the wrong questions. Without speaking, she turned the object once in her hand, the faint gleam of its surface catching the overhead light. Then she slid it back into the hidden compartment of the purse, the movement unhurried and precise, as though she were placing a teacup back into a cupboard. The clasp snapped shut with a soft metallic click that seemed to settle the air between them. Daniels didn't break eye contact, and she didn't either. That subtle nod passed between them then, not a signal, not a command, but an understanding. Whatever had just happened, whatever had been revealed in that kitchen, would remain exactly where it belonged. Daniels shifted his weight, leaning one shoulder slightly against the doorframe, his expression giving away nothing to the deputies still moving about outside. "I'll make sure they don't wander this way again," he said quietly, his tone as measured as if he were discussing the weather. Margaret didn't respond right away. She reached down to adjust the strap of the purse, tucking it securely over her arm the way she always did before heading into town. Her fingers lingered there for a moment, a small act that carried far more intent than it appeared. Only when she was satisfied did she give a small, deliberate nod of her own. Daniels took that as his cue to straighten. His boots made a soft scrape against the worn floorboards as he stepped back, but he didn't turn his back fully on her until he was at the threshold. Even then, he paused, glancing over his shoulder one last time before pulling the door open. The cold afternoon light spilled in, along with the sound of muffled voices from the yard. Margaret stayed seated, watching through the window as Daniels crossed the porch, his broad frame moving toward the patrol cars. The deputies were securing the thieves in the back seats, their heads lowered, their hands cupped behind them. One of them looked toward the house, his eyes scanning the windows as though searching for a final clue about what exactly had gone wrong for them here. Margaret didn't give him the satisfaction of being seen. Her hand rested on the purse again, thumb idly tracing the familiar ridges in the leather. To anyone else, it might have looked like a nervous habit. To her, it was reassurance, a reminder that the promise she'd made all those years ago had not been broken, and that the object was back where it belonged. Outside, the engines of patrol cars rumbled to life, the sound low and steady. The red and blue lights flashed once more, reflecting briefly off the glass panes before the vehicles began to roll slowly down the drive. Daniels was the last to leave, his car pulling out behind the others, the crunch of gravel fading until it was only the familiar quiet of the countryside. Margaret rose then, moving to the sink to pour herself a glass of water. Her movements were calm, her posture steady, as though she had not just been cornered in her own home. The purse remained on the table, exactly where she had placed it, the clasp now firmly shut. She glanced at it once more before turning back to her glass, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips, not a triumph, but a quiet certainty. Whatever had just taken place, it was finished, and in the end, nothing that truly mattered had changed hands. From the kitchen window, Margaret could see them being brought down the steps, one after the other, the deputies flanking them on each side. The taller one's shoulders were squared, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the patrol cars waiting at the end of the gravel drive. The smaller one spoke first, his voice sharp and defensive, carrying across the yard in broken phrases. She couldn't make out every word, but but the tone was enough. Accusations thrown at his companion, at the deputies, even at her. The taller man answered him with his own rush of words, louder and angrier, and soon the two were talking over each other, each desperate to control the story before it reached the sheriff's desk. One claimed they had come for directions and been met with hostility. The other insisted he had been pulled along into something he hadn't agreed to, a reluctant participant caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Neither could keep their sentences straight for more than a breath, their accounts tangling like weeds. The deputies didn't react to the noise. They moved with the kind of steady rhythm that comes from long practice. Firm grips on each man's arm, measured steps toward the waiting cars, the sound of boots crunching into the gravel in sync. Every time one of the thieves twisted slightly to emphasize a point, the deputy at his side gave the smallest tug on the cuffs, a silent reminder that their forward path wasn't changing. The late afternoon light was thinning, the shadows of the trees stretching across the drive. The flashing lights from the cruisers painted brief, jagged streaks of red and blue over the thieves' faces, making their expressions appear even more strained. The smaller one's voice cracked as he turned his head toward Margaret's house, as if she might step outside and somehow back his version of events. She didn't move from her place at the table. Sheriff Daniels stood off to the side, one hand resting on the roof of his car, watching the scene without interfering. His face was unreadable, his posture relaxed in a way that only came when he knew the outcome was already decided. When the taller man tried to slow his pace to get another word in, Daniels gave a short nod toward the deputies, and they resumed walking with a little more insistence. At the first car, the smaller man was guided toward the open back door. He hesitated, still talking, his voice rising as though volume might shift the balance in his favor. The deputy at his side waited, letting him burn through another sentence before giving a gentle but undeniable push that brought his head down and guided him inside. The door shut with a solid, final sound. The taller one went into the second car more quietly, though his jaw was tight, and his eyes stayed locked on the sheriff until the door closed between them. Margaret could just make out his muffled voice through the glass as he kept speaking, either to himself or to the empty air. The deputies checked the locks, exchanged a few quiet words with Daniels, and began moving toward their driver's seats. The engines came to life one by one, their low rumble filling the stillness that had settled over the property. Margaret watched the taillights flare as the cars shifted into gear, the gravel crunching under their slow roll back toward the road. She noticed how neither man inside the vehicles had stopped talking, their heads still moving, mouths still forming the arguments that no longer mattered. Daniels was the last to leave. He cast one last glance toward the house, giving a slight lift of his chin that was almost goodbye, then slid into his own car. The convoy moved off the property, the sound of tires fading into the distance until there was nothing left but the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on her wall. Margaret reached for her glass of water, her eyes lingering for a moment on the purse resting on the table, before taking a slow sip and letting the silence return. The door had barely closed behind the last deputy when Sheriff Daniels stepped back inside, the brim of his hat tilted low as if he were weighing whether to speak at all. Margaret was still at the kitchen table, her purse sitting exactly where she'd left it, the clasp gleaming faintly in the overhead light. Daniels pulled out a chair across from her and lowered himself into it without ceremony. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ticking clock on the wall filled the space between them, steady and unhurried, the same rhythm it had kept for decades. His eyes shifted from her face to the purse and back again. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice low and even. "What was in there?" The question wasn't sharp or accusatory. It carried the tone of a man who knew an answer might not be given, but had to ask all the same. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. She let her hands rest lightly on the table, fingers interlaced, as if she were settling in for a conversation about the weather. "You still keeping bees, Harold?" she asked, her voice steady, almost casual. Daniels blinked once, his brow creasing slightly at the shift. "Still got a few hives," he said, leaning back just a fraction. "Not as many as I used to." "Good honey's harder to find than it used to be," Margaret replied, as though she hadn't heard the weight in his question at all. Her eyes moved to the window, catching the fading light over the field beyond. She didn't rush her words, and she didn't fill the silence that followed. Daniels tapped a finger once against the table, a slow, muted sound. "That thing you had, it worth all that fuss?" She turned back to him with the faintest of smiles, one that gave away nothing but the fact that she had heard him perfectly. "Some things are worth more than money," she said, her tone so mild it could be mistaken for small talk. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to read the years written in her face. Margaret had lived in this county longer than most people had been alive. He knew her well enough to understand that pushing further would get him nothing but a polite wall of words. "It's safe now," he asked at last. "It always has been," she said simply, her hands never moving toward the purse. The air between them settled again, heavy but not uncomfortable. Daniels gave a slow nod, as though the matter were closed, whether he liked it or not. He stood, his chair scraping gently against the floor, and reached for his hat. Margaret rose with him, walking him to the door. On the porch, the chill in the air had deepened, and the light was nearly gone from the sky. Daniels paused at the top step, looking out toward the road before turning back to her. "If anyone comes sniffing around again," he began. "They won't," she said, her voice calm, certain. He searched her face one last time, then touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Good night, Margaret." She watched him cross the yard, his silhouette framed against the dim glow of the cruiser's headlights. When the car rolled away, she stood for a moment longer, the night air cool against her skin, before stepping back inside. The purse remained on the table where it had been all evening, untouched except by her hand. Margaret sat down again, her fingers brushing over the worn leather, feeling the familiar weight inside. True worth, she knew, wasn't always something that could be measured or displayed. Sometimes it was the kind of value only a promise could hold, quiet, enduring, and protected by silence. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the house settle around her, and let the matter rest exactly where it was. The knock came on a Saturday morning, light but deliberate, the kind of sound made by someone who expected to be welcomed in. Margaret had been standing at the stove, coaxing the kettle toward a boil when she heard it. She moved to the door with unhurried steps, pulling it open to find a man in a long wool coat standing on her porch. He was neatly dressed, his scarf tucked precisely under his collar, and he carried a leather satchel that looked nearly as old as her purse. "Mrs. Ellison?" he asked, his voice polite but practiced. "I'm Thomas Whitfield, from the Vermont Historical Society." He extended a hand, which she did not take right away. "I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Margaret studied him in silence for a beat too long, her gaze flicking once to the satchel before returning to his face. "Most people who come up this road are either lost or selling something," she said. "I'm not lost," Whitfield replied, the corners of his mouth curving into what was meant to be a reassuring smile. "And I'm not selling anything. I'm here because I've heard. Well, there's been some talk in town about an item in your possession, something of considerable historical interest." The steam from the kettle whistled faintly in the kitchen, but Margaret didn't move to tend it. "Talk has a way of making its own story," she said. Whitfield shifted his weight, his shoes creaking against the porch boards. "I understand your caution, but if what you have is what I think it is, it could be of great value to Vermont's heritage. We'd ensure it was preserved properly, researched, documented, protected." Margaret's expression didn't change. "Things can be protected without being put in a glass case," she said. "Sometimes better so." He hesitated, as though deciding how much his own interest to reveal. "May I at least see it? Even a glimpse would help me confirm." "No." The word was gentle but final. Whitfield cleared his throat, glancing briefly at the quiet field stretching behind her house. "Mrs. Ellison, our records are missing pieces of the Ellison family history, particularly from the years around the war. If this object is connected to that time, as I believe it is, we could—" Margaret's hand moved to the doorframe, her fingers resting on the worn wood. "My husband once told me that not everything from the past belongs to the public. Some things are meant to stay where they are." He studied her, perhaps expecting that a reminder of her late husband might soften her resolve. Instead, she met his gaze without blinking. "I respect that," he said finally, though his tone betrayed a thin thread of disappointment. "But if you change your mind, the society's doors are always open." We'd be honored to give a home." Margaret opened the door a fraction wider, not to invite him in, but to make his departure easier. "It already has a home," she said. Whitfield gave a small nod, adjusted the strap of his satchel, and stepped back onto the porch steps. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Ellison." She watched him walk down the path to his car, his breath visible in the cold air, his pace brisk but thoughtful. The engine started. The tires crunched over the gravel, and soon he was gone, leaving the road as empty as it had been before. Margaret closed the door, returned to the kitchen, and turned off the kettle. She poured the hot water into her teacup, the steam curling upward, and glanced at the purse resting on the side table. The leather was worn, the clasp still firm, the weight unchanged. Whatever Whitfield had come looking for, it was still hers. Kept not out of greed or secrecy, but out of a quiet understanding that some pieces of history were safest in the hands that already held them. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, casting long rectangles of light across the table where Margaret sat with her cup of tea gone cold. The purse rested beside her elbow, as it had so many times before, its familiar weight a silent reminder of the choice she had yet to make. She had not told anyone, not Frank next door, not the sheriff, and certainly not anyone from the Historical Society, what she was thinking. The matter was hers alone, and that made the decision both simpler and heavier. She thought of the man from the society, of the way his words had been wrapped in good intentions and polished phrases. There was no doubt that if she handed it over, the object would be cataloged, photographed, and placed in a carefully climate-controlled room where it would sit behind glass for curious visitors to admire. There would be a small plaque with a few sentences about its history, perhaps her name mentioned as its donor. In a way, that would be a kind of immortality, not for her, but for the thing itself. It would no longer be hidden. It would belong to the state, the public, the story of Vermont. But Margaret knew that once something was given away, it could never be taken back. Museums had their own politics, their own gatekeepers, and she had lived long enough to know that objects sometimes vanished into back rooms, traded, or sold when no one was paying attention. Even with the best of intentions, what was visible today could be locked away tomorrow. And then there was the other part. The part her husband had impressed upon her all those years ago when he pressed the object into her hands. His voice still lived in her memory, quiet but unyielding. Some things are not for sale, not for show, not for anyone who doesn't understand them. She lifted the purse and set it in her lap, her fingers tracing the faint cracks in the leather. Inside, the hidden compartment felt exactly as it always had, the cool shape resting against the lining. She closed her eyes and pictured the day he had given it to her. The war had been over for years, but his face still carried shadows from it. He hadn't told her everything. She doubted he'd told anyone everything, but she understood enough. The object was a piece of their family, not because it was forged or found by an Ellison, but because it had been entrusted to one. That trust was the thing she valued most. She imagined what it would mean to give it up. No more quiet weight in her purse. No more knowledge that she alone kept it safe. Perhaps that was selfish. Perhaps it was simply the way one keeps faith with the past. In a museum, it would be touched only by white-gloved hands, viewed through glass by people who would never know its full story. Here, in her keeping, it would remain whole, its history intact, its meaning unfiltered. Margaret sipped the last of her tea, now lukewarm, and set the cup aside. She looked out the window toward the fields, bare and gray this time of year, and thought about how seasons change without asking permission. Time would take her, as it took everyone, but until it did, she could choose. The purse would stay where it had always been, close enough to reach for, far enough from curious eyes. The kettle on the stove began to hum softly, but she didn't rise to tend it. The decision had settled inside her, as solid and immovable as the hills that ringed her farm. The museum could wait. The world could wait. Some things belonged not to history books, but to the hands that had promised never to let them go. And for as long as she could draw a breath, those hands would be hers. The house was quiet enough to hear the slow ticking of the clock in the front room, each sound stretching into the next as if the afternoon had no end. Margaret sat at the table with the purse in front of her, the brass clasp glinting faintly in the pale light coming through the curtains. Her hands rested on either side of it, the skin lined and spotted from years of work. the fingers still steady. She didn't open it right away. She let herself feel the weight of what was inside, without seeing it, the way she might linger over the last sentence of a letter before reading it again. When she finally eased the clasp open, the small click seemed louder than it should have been. The leather hinges creaked, familiar as an old floorboard. She reached into the hidden compartment, her fingertips finding the cool, solid shape that had been there for decades. Lifting it out, she turned it over in her hands, letting her eyes take in every edge and curve. Time had darkened it, softened the sheen, but it still carried the same quiet authority it had the day her husband placed it in her keeping. She thought of the time she had nearly taken out for someone else to see, the words she had rehearsed and never spoken. Most people would only see an artifact, something to measure, to research, to write about in careful language. To her, it was more than that. It was the last thing her husband had trusted her with. It was a fragment of history bound up with memory, duty, and the unspoken understanding that some treasures were meant to stay in the shadows until the right light found them. Margaret turned it in her palm, feeling the weight settle in the center of her hand. She imagined briefly the day she would no longer be here to guard it. The thought didn't frighten her. It was as inevitable as the turning of the seasons outside her window. The only question was who would be worthy to hold it next. She pictured faces, most of them gone now, some too young, others too far removed from the values that had shaped her life. There was no clear heir yet, but she trusted that one would come, just as the object had come to her. The idea comforted her. She didn't need to solve the puzzle today. She only needed to keep the piece safe until the right moment arrived. That moment might be years away, or it might come without warning, the way certain things in life always did. Her role was to be ready, to keep the promise she had made when she first accepted it. With slow, deliberate care, Margaret lowered the object back into the hidden compartment. Her fingers smoothed the lining, as though tucking in a child for the night. She closed the purse, pressing the clasp until it clicked, sealing the weight inside again. The sound was small but final. She placed the purse back on its usual chair by the window, where the afternoon light touched it in passing but never lingered. From here, it looked like nothing more than a well-used piece of leather, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its story. That was the way she preferred it. As the shadows lengthened across the kitchen, she settled into her chair and watched the light change. The purse would be there tomorrow and the day after, and for as many days as she had left. One day, when her hands were no longer here to hold it, someone else would open it and understand. Until then, it belonged exactly where it was, silent, steady, and waiting. The morning after the visit from the Historical Society, the farmhouse looked exactly as it always had. The frost on the porch steps caught the first light, glinting faintly before melting away. In the kitchen, Margaret moved with the same steady pace she had kept for years, filling the kettle, slicing bread, setting the radio low in the background. The purse hung in its place by the door, the worn leather catching a sliver of sunlight through the narrow front window. Anyone passing through would see it and think nothing of it. That was the point. She had always kept her life in quiet order, each object in its place, each day a reflection of the one before it. There had been disturbances, some small, some nearly shattering, but the rhythm always returned. Now, after the weeks of visits, questions, and speculation, that rhythm felt more precious than ever. The purse, though outwardly unchanged, seemed heavier on the hook, not in weight, but in meaning. She didn't look at it directly as she moved about her morning, yet she was aware of it the way one is aware of a heartbeat. Constant, present, rarely thought about until something threatens it. Outside, the gravel driveway was still marked faintly by the tracks of the sheriff's cruiser from that night, but the wind and a few light snows had begun to blur them. Frank's barn roof glinted across the field, and the sound of his tractor hummed faintly on the air. Life in the countryside did not pause for anyone's private battles. There was wood to split, animals to feed, and small errands to run. Margaret welcomed that fact. As she pulled on her coat and laced her boots, she glanced at the purse. The leather straps were frayed in places, the brass clasp dulled from decades of use. To anyone else, it was nothing but an old woman's shopping bag, holding a wallet, a handkerchief, and perhaps a list written in tidy pencil. She knew otherwise, and so did a few others now, though not enough to trouble her. Secrets were safest when hidden in plain sight. She reached for the purse, feeling the familiar pull on her shoulder. Inside, the object rested exactly where she had left it, silent and unassuming. The simple act of taking it with her was both habit and insurance, though she doubted she would need it today or any other day soon. Still, her husband's words echoed in her mind, as they always did when the weight pressed against her side. You carry it until the day you can pass it to someone who understands. By late morning, she was back on the market. The purse returned to its hook beside the door. The groceries were put away, the kettle set to boil, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon from the bread cooling on the counter. Sunlight shifted across the floorboards, inching closer to the purse before sliding past it, leaving it in shadow again. Margaret sat at the table with her tea, hands wrapped around the mug, eyes drifting toward the fields beyond the window. In another week, she might visit the churchyard to tend her husband's grave. She might walk the trail through the woods where they had once picked berries in the summer. And every time she left the house, the purse would go with her, unremarkable to anyone who saw it. It was an ordinary sight in an ordinary home, and that was the way she intended it to stay. The world didn't need to know that hanging from the worn leather strap was not just a purse, but a vault, a promise, and a history that would outlast her. For now, it was just another part of the room, silent, steady, and always within reach.